Well, kia ora tātou. My name is Ekant Veer. We're here at the Kura Umanga, the UC Business School, to talk about behaviour change. I am here with a couple of my mates from Research First. First up, Carl Davidson.
Hello.
And Petra, who is what is your exact title, Petra?
I'm the Insights Manager at Research
I was going to say the Director of Behavioural Insights, which sounds flashy.
Can I have that as my title?
Take that. And we were asked to talk about behaviour change in its general form. So I'm a consumer behaviourist. That's the sort of research area I do. So I describe myself as a professional people watcher, but it's just so complex and big. Carl, you are, on your website, you say you are the senior social scientist?
That's right. So psychology and sociology is my background. And again, behaviour change is something we're fascinated about.
And your new Director of Behavioural Insights at Research
absolutely.
Petra. Tell us about yourself.
Do I have to report to you?
Yes, I think so. I have a diverse background. I've done study in psychology, law and political science, and international development. And now I manage the research team at Research First. So.
Awesome. And when I was thinking about behaviour, human behaviour, behavioural insights, behavioural change, we were asked to think about, well, what are 2 or 3 things that people can take away from this corridor and go, right, now I know a bit more, now I can do a bit more. And the first one that I thought of is, it's complex. You cannot fix this in 3 things. You cannot fix this in 30 minutes.
That's a cop-out. that is a cop-out. It's true, but it's a cop-out. I mean, but the thing about behaviour change is it's hard, right? Yeah. And the thing we always say is think about New Year's resolutions. If you want to see how hard it is to change behaviour, just look at New Year's resolutions. You might not make resolutions, but somebody does.
Sure.
And when you make a resolution, you're thinking about something that you want to change about you, right? You freely choose that. You publicly acclaim you're going to change it. And the research says by about mid-January, you've already stopped doing it, right? It's really hard.
It's also so rationalized by a lot of people like us. We go to study, well, that's the motivation, that's the driver, that's the kicker. Therefore, while a lot of behavior that we observe and we see and we act ourselves is completely irrational. Sure. It is unconscious. We don't realize what we're doing or why we're doing or how we do it. Again, as a professional people watcher, I see things in people and I go, I wonder why they do that. And there's no reason why
but
they
if
do
you
that.
think, you think about dual process theory cognition, we're talking about this just on Monday. You know, they reckon that 90% of your decision making is automated. So that's why you do irrational and dumb things. But I think that's one of the takeaways. You know, when you think about behaviour change, it's not about agency. Willpower isn't enough. It's about structure and agency. It's why we have to design environments to support desired change.
It's completely true. I mean, my area of pro-social marketing, my area of health promotion in particular, going right back to the early 80s, they were talking about, you know, education is one tiny part. Do not just focus on education, but that's where governments go when it comes to, right, we should vaccinate, we should eat healthily. Let's tell you what to do and you will naturally do it, which is just completely not right. Creating environments that allow and enable this, creating environments that make it hard not to do unhealthy behaviour sometimes is good.
So this is information deficit theory, right? The idea that if people don't know what to do and we tell them what to do, somehow they will magically do the thing. No one believes that anymore, apart from government agencies trying to shape behaviour, right? I mean, I'm much more interested in the intention-action gap, you know, which is an attitudinal thing where people go, I really want to buy things that are more sustainable, eat more healthily. I want to do it. You're not telling me to do it, and I still don't do it. That's the bit I think is really interesting psychologically.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point from actually looking at the data of behaviour, right? So when we're doing research, we tend to look at why do people say that they do what they do, right? So that's where research starts. It's in the, can you tell me why you did that? Or can you tell me why you're buying this or looking at this product? Or can you tell me why you're buying sustainable products? And everyone will tell you that they want to buy sustainable products. They want to help the environment. They want to do these things, but they're still not doing it. So it's really actually looking at those unconscious things that we're doing and actually going, okay, I want to buy sustainable products, but I'm not doing it when I go to the supermarket. What is it actually, and targeting and honing in on why are we not actually doing that? And that's looking at implicit. You know, it's not the things that we say or we think, it's actually what's happening in our behaviour and around us that's motivating us or not motivating us to actually act.
I mean, that's a great point in terms of consumer behaviour because, you know, the professional practice of studying it is always looking for a behavioural anchor. So rather than asking people what are they going to do and then getting to explain what they did, we look at what they did and then try and work out backwards what are the factors that drove that behaviour or didn't drive the desired behaviour. Why was there inertia for the behaviour we don't want?
And so one of my colleagues in America, I mean, he was brought into lots of schools to try and encourage healthy eating, and the principals and the canteen staff would always say, kids don't like eating fruit. They don't like eating fruit. They want pizza. They want pizza. And he's like, of course not. You put the fruit and veg right in the back corner where nobody wants to go. And he said, bring that right to the front. And kids will walk past and they'll grab a banana. They'll grab an apple.
This is about environments, right?
That's right.
This is choice
really
architecture.
super simple.
You know, if you can manipulate the choices, and I mean that in the nicest possible way, if you can manipulate the choices people make and leave healthy foods at the checkout and not Twix bars, they're going to buy those too, right?
Yep.
I mean, you think about how supermarkets work. You know, they're designed to get you to do certain things. They're set out in a particular way. We can use all of those mechanisms to promote healthy behaviour if we want to.
One of my favourite academics that I studied under at the University of Auckland, and she's now the head of plant and food in Auckland, Denise Conroy, used to talk about how real estate in supermarkets at eye level was always the most expensive stuff because that's the most real estate. Except when you go to the kids aisle and then it's down at the eye level of...
Beautiful.
So when it's confectionery and stuff, the most expensive stuff is at the average height of an 8-year-old, not the average height of an adult. And little tweaks like that. And this is where I start making little prompts, which I think will start a next conversation. So there was the book Nudge that came out, which spoke a lot about this, about the idea that it's not about these conscious, intentional choices, but it was about little tiny changes that are more easy to sustain.
Yeah, designing the environment, right? And what I love about this is it goes back to the notion that willpower's not enough. So there's a great framework that is COMB, right? C-O-M-B, that says if you want to change behaviour, you've got to have the capacity, you've got to have the opportunity, you've got to have the motivation. And the problem in almost every social marketing campaign in the history of the world is it goes straight to motivation. And it doesn't say, do you have the opportunity to change, which we can get through designing environments? Do you have the capacity to change? Like, can you actually do the behaviour we want? So if you think about something like, how do we get people to come back to work following the pandemic? How do we design an environment that reduces friction, right? You know, nudges them in the right direction and gets the kind of behaviour that they want.
Post-pandemic is actually a really interesting area to think about, though, because the greatest opportunity for change actually happens when we've had our world shaken up around us, right? So that's when we can actually encourage and motivate and tap into the person's actual innate desire and ability to change, because all of the unconscious things that they do have been shaken up and it's no longer habit. But the question actually becomes is, why do we actually want them to be back in work in the first place? What is it? Is it actually a behaviour that we're stating they have to do because it's the way it's always been done, or is that actually a behaviour that's beneficial and useful for society and for the people employed in the business?
So one of my honours students post-earthquake did the study on effectively what she titled it, the value in broken things. And she looked at all the positives that came out of the earthquake, and one of them was people who had just gone, I hate my job. I hate having to go to a job that I hate just to buy stuff to make me feel better about the job that I hate. And they were people throwing away their careers in order to do what they've always wanted to do, but you need that sort of, that inorganic shake to do things. And I think the earthquake, the pandemic did that for me. Is like, I don't like working from home in a cramped house because I've got teenagers, I got my wife, we're all in the same space. It's really hard to get things done. And then I'm like, I am loving being around my whānau. This is why I go to work.
Well, so you talked about nudges, right? So nudges are kind of pro-social prompts. But the opposite of nudges are sludges. You know, like the friction. Like, what's the friction in the system that stops people doing the thing you want them to do, or the thing you think's better for them? You know, that might be bureaucracy. It might literally be it's hard to find a car park. You know, it could be any number of things. And what that talks about is something we all know, which is we need to look at drivers and barriers.
Absolutely.
Like, you know, it's really easy to think about one and not the other.
And this is where I think the UCMBA in particular, the sort of pivot that it made, especially straight after the pandemic, to do more in the digital transformation space with Elsa Marie Botha and Hamish Duff, really leading that, was a fascinating time to do it, because you're trying to teach digital transformation as everyone is being forced into a digital world. And for me in particular, what the pandemic in the digital space really exacerbated were the inherent and almost hidden inequities that exist in our society.
Totally.
That access to good Wi-Fi, access to computers, whatever, just enabled some people in professional jobs to continue, while those people who are working frontline, despite all the government support and things like that, still very difficult to sustain your family.
Yeah, and if I pick up that point and go back, you know, we're talking about behaviour change, and behaviour change is really about changing minds as well as behaviour, right? And I think the whole not just the MBA, but the executive education program is all about changing people's minds, empowering you to change people's minds, but also having your own mind changed. And we say, if you can change minds, you can change anything, right? Which has to be kind of the value proposition that sits at the heart of all of that education. And, think about, where does that happen a lot? Well, definitely if you think about executive education, climate action, kill your darlings. It's like, come on, these are wonderful. Design thinking and the MBA, creative challenge.
Creative challenge
They're
is a good
all about
example.
expanding people's minds and changing their behaviour.
The one part, and I know, Carl, you're a huge advocate for this, but also just the whole culture that you bring at Research First, that critical thinking piece, that ability to stop and go, wait, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
We don't do that enough.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's covered in the MBA and their Business Research Methods mini course. But I was going to talk about that, like learning the principle of falsification, which we should all know as scientists, right? Science progresses not by proving ideas right, but by proving them wrong. And yet our brains are wired for confirmation bias. We're always looking for evidence that we're right. Actually hanging on to that notion of falsification, what would it take to prove that this was a bad idea, or what would it take to prove to everybody else that this was a bad idea?
There are still academics out there who teach the amazingness of Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how universally useful it is to understanding humans and human behavior. Oh, we're doing this because it's self-actualization. So I only bring in Maslow into my class when we're talking about consumers to show why it's so flawed.
Yeah.
That's not to say that it doesn't have value. However, the idea that you cannot progress into higher level thinking or behaving without those hygiene factors, for me, just doesn't seem to be right. And we see this again post-earthquakes, post-pandemic, where we're like, I don't have running water after the earthquakes, but I feel connected to my community and fauna.
We know that Maslow's hierarchy of needs was developed from a flawed sample size. So they were developed from a small group of Indigenous people who didn't even believe that what came out of it was accurate. So when you're looking at that, you're like, well, how can we even base our marketing or any aspect of behavioural change on a completely flawed system to begin with? And you're absolutely right. We see people who have nothing, they live on the streets, but they still, when they have money, will choose to go and buy things that fill a self-actualization need or something else that they want. They'll go and buy alcohol because it makes them happy, and not necessarily because they're addicted, just because they want to, have that thing that is for them, meeting a much higher need than actually I have to have housing, I have to have...
Or we see what others might see as completely irrational behaviour. Someone has given you something, you have very little, and you share it with those around you.
This is phenomenology, though, right?
Yeah,
this is a good old-fashioned phenomenological approach. You've got to understand the philosophy of the experience. Like sitting from the outside and trying to put a meaning on that experience makes no sense. You've got to get inside that person and help them understand how they construct that.
Can we wind back to that intention behaviour gap, though? Because I think it's super important. So my PhD 20 odd years ago was on encouraging kids living in poverty to eat healthily and exercise more. Basically, marketing doesn't help because they might have all the knowledge, all the intention, but when the community, when the environment, when the funding is not there to achieve this, it's just almost impossible. Now, Petra, you work in high performance sport and you know a lot in this area. Knowing and doing. Talk to us about that gap. Because, surely if you know the right thing, you would do the right thing, right?
No, absolutely not. Because it doesn't happen. You can know exactly what you need to do, but actually still struggle to take that step to do it. And a lot of that is looking at emotion. A lot of that is looking, I think there's something that we actually miss in behavioural science and in research as a whole is actually how does emotion play into doing or not doing something. So we look at motivations, we talk about that quite a bit. I'm really motivated to do this, but I still wake up in the morning and I don't want to go to training, or I don't want to go to work, or I don't want to do this. So actually finding the thing to address emotions. What is it that's barrier in my emotions that is actually making me go, I don't want to do this? That's not a conscious thing necessarily that we're talking about. It's that unconscious, I'm not future focused, right? That's a huge issue that we have is that temporal bias that we want to focus on the now and the easy and not actually take the steps required to achieve it.
But, the anthropological argument, I totally agree with that. But, that sets it up as though discounting the future is a problem. And it is a problem for a lot of healthy behaviour, but it makes utter sense from an anthropological point of view. Like, why would you want to give your money to 65-year-old Ekant? You don't know that guy. He's probably a dick. Like, why do you want to give him all your money? And if you think about most of human history, you're not going to live to be 65. So thinking about the future is something that comes extraordinarily hard to us.
And that exchange proposition between, here's $5, you give me some junk food.
Yeah.
Really easy exchange, instant satisfaction, instant gratification. Me walking half an hour a day and building up a heart rate and a sweat for the potential risk of my heart attack to reduce by 20% in 35 years' time is such a hard sell.
Yeah. But this is about designing environments,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
We've made the world easy,
Yeah.
right? So you know, when we were hunter-gatherers, fat and sugar were rare, so our brains reward us for getting it. And when we chase food or hunted food, we get to carry it and walk long distances. We don't have to do any of those anymore, right? But we still have the same brains that those people had. That's the challenge.
And those hunter-gatherers working in those communities, those smaller communities where they rely on each other, again, plays really well into some of those behavior change models that exist. So if we go back to Iron's work, theory of planned behavior, theory of recent action, basically said, does the person feel that sense of self-efficacy? Do they believe they can do this? And then what are the social norms? Now, I was raised in a what would be called a robust Indian upbringing, which is considered illegal now, I would say. Much of the behavior change policies my parents used, sort of thing. But you knew where you stood because it was very explicit within your whānau, within your family. These are the lines, these are the boundaries, this is what is expected of you. Now, in a dehumanized setting, where you are working, let's say, high-performance sport, but on the news are the amazing elite athletes, and you go, can I ever achieve that? When you're an executive and you're judging yourself against the very best executives, in reality, 95% of people, by definition, are not that elite. How do we build ourselves to a point where I feel motivated enough to do it, but I'm not so denigrated by how amazing other people are?
Well, so two things, right? What we know from psychology is everybody's winging it. Once you understand that everybody's winging it all the time, that's liberating. Secondly, we're talking about imposter phenomenon, really, aren't we? I mean, you have full access to all of your doubts.
Yes.
But if you watch Petra, all you get to see is Petra's performance, or we get to see you teaching and you're up there being magnificent, we don't get to see the doubts you're having. I get to see your performance, but I don't get to experience your doubts. Whereas when I want to get up and move, I can feel my anxiety rise, I feel my doubts, and I think I'm the only person in the world that feels like this, when everybody feels like this. So I think there is an education component. Everybody experiences imposter phenomenon, it happens all the time, everybody's winging it. Now you know that, let's see what we can actually do.
But it's not just the education component, because we've talked about, the imposter phenomenon, the feeling like everyone else is capable of it and I'm sitting over here. It's also, we've got to fill that gap somehow, right? So it's actually about how do we create not just environments, but actually cultures, which is about the people within the environment. So going back to that returning to work, if we want people to return to work, we can actually use some behavioural science principles to allow us to encourage people to go into that environment. Things that will create release of dopamine, the creating an environment where we're having pleasant exchanges. That's going to make a difference to people actually wanting to come into the office. And that's not just about creating the environment that makes it easy, but actually creating the desire for that social connection to happen.
What I love about this is it's pretty easy to see that actually, almost the first task of any successful manager is behaviour change. So that's a great link back to the MBA and the executive education, because if you're a good manager, you have to be good at changing minds or changing behaviours. And the higher up the organisation you go,
the more important this becomes. And for me, maybe this is the bias I have as a researcher, it has to come down to understanding what those behaviours are, what are the values that are driving that. And so if we're going back to trying to get people back into work, we might not explicitly say this to ourselves, to our manager, to our co-workers, but I suspect most people are unconsciously or consciously thinking, what is the value of me being in that office?
Sure.
What is the value for the 30-minute to 1.5 hour commute each way that I might do? What is the value I generate from that, from the 8 hours being physically there? And a lot of the time, unfortunately, what is being done by executives who want people in the workplace is, I don't trust you to do a good job at home, therefore you need to be here where I can watch you. That is what's felt by people, whether that's true or not. It could be, we want to build a culture where we are close. We want to build that whanongatanga where we are together.
But again, this is exactly what the MBA and the executive education program helps do, right? It helps build psychologically sophisticated workplaces, or enable enable executives to build psychologically sophisticated workplaces that actually draw on our understanding of humans and groups to make workplaces rewarding.
And so I see this at the undergrad level at UC. I teach both on the MBA and at the undergrad, and there was a survey done amongst the students, and they said, we love the flexibility of hybrid learning. We can come and go as we want. This is really good because I can fit in, work, I can fit in life. And then 3 or 4 questions down and said, we really hate the vibe on campus. It's really quiet. We don't know how we get it. I was like, and you kind of want to say, 2 and 2 together, but there has to still be some element of access enabling. If someone does not have access to a physical space or cannot access a physical space, they are disproportionately held back, whether that's family commitments, whether that's work commitments, whether it is physical, emotional.
Yeah, so
access.
You talked about behaviour change models, and I suspect in the years since you finished your PhD, we've had the Behavioural Insights unit out of the UK, right, and all of that work. And things like the EAST framework, which we lean on all the time at work. You've got to make it easy. The behaviour change you want to see, it's got to be easy. It's got to be accessible. It has to be sociable, and it has to be timely. A is attractive. It's got to be easy, attractive, sociable, and timely. By that it means it's got to be easy to do. You've got to want to do it. Other people must be doing it.
Correct.
And you've got to make the intervention at the right time.
Absolutely.
Thinking through EAST, I mean, it's a high-level framework, but it's always useful because you talked about social norms. And the question that we've had, and I'm sure you've faced it, if you think about the way the business world is changing, is how much of our assumptions about behaviour change are based on essentially a monocultural view of humans.
Yes, absolutely.
And if you think about the weird challenge for us, right? 95% of psychology papers are done with like 12% of the world's population, right? They draw samples from white, educated, industrialised, rich, democratic worlds. As we get more global and as New Zealand becomes more multicultural, how relevant are those models?
And so this is something that I know you and I have talked about, I think via text. This is where we do our debates sometimes. Is as a research company, the value you provide to people is data points. However, the more we go down this line of, I have the most data, I have the best data, how much do we dilute those nuanced, interesting and fascinating voices that might just be washed away because they don't maintain the mainstream?
Well, you should have been with us on Monday because we were talking about how
the
paradigm for 2022 and beyond has to be anthropological. It has to be anthropological. The fact we're talking about phenomenology is no coincidence. Thinking about the extent to which people live in different worlds, getting away from a naive realist view about what's driving their behaviour, thinking about their experience and the way they construct their experience to understand how you change your influence, or even just understand their behaviour. That's got to be the future for us.
Absolutely. And this I'm reflecting, my parents live in the Blue Mountains in west of Sydney. They're not mountains, they're barely hills, but that's fine. But last time we saw them was 2019 in the midst of the bushfires, massive bushfires. And what came out of a lot of that is a lot of the Aboriginal populations in Australia never really struggled with this because they knew how to do controlled burns to keep them. But that was all put to one side because of what was felt was better, easier, more picturesque, having blah, 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 blah. Same at UC, that the value of Mātauranga Māori and Māori worldview, Māori knowledge is becoming more and more important as a treaty university where we respect our obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi and understand that different lenses on the world matter.
Yes, and it's lenses that excites me because there's a guy called Philip Gibson who is Christchurch-based. He was the Prime Minister's advisor on earthquake resilience, and he's ex-MFAT. And he always used to say how poorly we drew on Asian influences, like how badly, because we don't speak those languages. Why aren't we making more of Chinese ways of understanding organisations, management, obligations, our relationships to the environment, Japanese ways? Like, think about what happens in New Zealand. We default to the US case studies and journals. We have a look at the UK, we might have a look at Australia. If we're really radical, we might look at Northern Europe. What are they doing in Finland and Norway? But pretty much after that, we don't look at different lenses and different ways of understanding the world.
And especially when these different cultures are making up the majority of our workforce now. It's actually very uncommon for a workforce to be looking like us around here. It's your Asian, your Japanese, your tangata whenua, your tangata moana, your Pacific people that are making up our workforce. So if we're assuming that people are going to do things in a workplace based on our white Western view of things, that's actually never going to allow us to create strong, safe workplaces where people want to be.
Yeah, and again, back to the MBA and the executive education program, that notion of the VUCA world runs throughout it, right? So we're living in a world which is much more volatile, much more uncertain, much more complex, much more ambiguous. How do we actually empower people to thrive in that world? And it's not going to be by taking a particular theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, based on a particular sample, a weird one, and applying it to everybody, right? Actually learning the ability to, I guess, pivot. I hate that word.
So, so those rapid pivots and business agility. That word access, which I know you put into easy by accident, but it's so important because accessibility to change is so interesting for me. I work a lot with the health system in New Zealand, and when we talk about access with medical professionals, a lot of the time they're looking at the angle of the ramp for the wheelchair to get up. I'm like, no, we're talking about whether a young man who's struggling with his own mental illness feels comfortable enough to talk to a GP about that. Because if he doesn't feel that he has access to someone he can trust, then it doesn't matter how great that GP is or how great our public health system is, you're never going to get there. So some work I did with the Mental Health Foundation a long time ago was looking primarily at men's mental health, and 85% of men that we surveyed said, yeah, we would love to stand next to a brother who was going through a mental health crisis. We will be that supporter for them.
Right.
Only 8% would ever admit to another man that they were going through. So that gulf between the 8 and the 85 is the big thing that in behaviour change we need to look at as well.
Well, that's the intention impact gap. We see it everywhere. It's funny because we're doing a bit of work on emission reduction, right? And it's exactly the same problem. You know, the emission reduction planning deals with a very different group of people to those that have to adapt to climate change. The people who are most impacted by climate change are the most vulnerable, and they have almost the least ability to impact emissions. People that can. The people that make the most impact on reducing emissions are those that can easily get out of the consequences of their behaviour.
So I know I started with, it's so complex we can never fix this. But I think there are some strands that do align. Feeling the ability to change, that efficacy piece. Has
knowing
to be
that change is possible.
Knowing that change is possible, and knowing that you have the ability to change. Those people who externalize a lot of their behavior and feel this is because of kismet, this is because of my genes, whatever, we know that external locus of control does hinder change. For me, alignment with your values is hugely important. And this is where, for me, why I love teaching on the master's programs, on the executive ed and the MBA, is because people want to be there, but also they want to dive deeper into why. That why question is super important. What is the values that I bring to the table? What are the values that I feel are important? And as much as we crapped all over Maslow's hierarchy of needs, there are aspects in there where I value this. I want that.
It's that motivation piece, right? Like that's the part that Maslow's hierarchy of need tried to touch on and didn't quite make it, is it is actually the motivation to change. I value these things, therefore I want to do them, even if my behaviour is not yet reflecting that.
And the whole implicit nature of a hierarchy was that this is more important than this, when in reality values have fluctuated.
So I agree with all of that, and it's a yes and. We also need to think about structure, not just agency.
Absolutely.
You know, there are times when willpower is just not enough.
Absolutely.
So if you can externalise that willpower through checklists, through score sheets, through prompts, through a community, it's going to be easier. If you can design your environment to support pro-social change, that's going to help. I think we need to always think about agency and structure when we think about behaviour.
Final thoughts then, behaviour change. The sorts of things that you would love to see more of, or accepted, or used more. If you had your magic wand, Petra, and you were able to say, this is what I would love to have access to in order to understand human behaviour and hopefully drive human behaviour to achieve the goals you have, what are the sort of things you'd love to see?
From my perspective, it's really those tools to really dig down and understand the implicit. So utilising neuromarketing, neuro research. Though we tend to generalise in that area as well, but it actually gives us some ability to look at behaviour and why it's happening without having to ask the people why it's happening. When you combine that with then the reasoned discussions with an individual. I think that's really powerful, the ability to combine both together, the implicit and the explicit. Actually, you know, the ability to do that more would be probably my key thing for behaviour.
It's interesting. I think my behavioural science came with a big bang. You know, you can imagine, you know, when Nudge came out and all of that stuff. And it seems like we're retreating from it. And I like that. I don't mean we're at full speed retreat, but it's like we've got a humility now about what behaviour change can actually do. Like how powerful a nudge is really. And I love that humility, because one of the things it reinforces is that behaviour change is not a switch.
Absolutely.
You know, you don't throw a switch and that person changes forever. You know, it's a pattern of behaviour that gets reinforced. And if you reinforce it enough, maybe it becomes a new habit. I really like that idea.
I would really love some honest, radical transparency from everyone. That, like you said, you know, we're all winging it. We're all faking it.
We're all winging it. Yeah.
I would love people to be okay with opening up about that. To say, I'm really struggling right now, or I'm really scared right now, or things like that.
Well, we touched on this before, right? Knowing we're going to have bad days.
Yep.
You know, knowing we're going to have bad days, that we're not always going to be at our best in the workplace, as a partner, as a parent, whatever. That's the first thing. The second thing is knowing that when we're tired and stressed, all of those good behaviours are going to fly away if we don't do something to tie them down, which is about environmental design or externalising our motivation. Changing minds and changing behaviour is a superpower. You know, if you can do it, it's a superpower. If you can change people's minds, you can change anything.
Sure.
And so, you know, the way that the NBA gives us some threads that we can pull together to make us better executives, make us understand people better, to get better outcomes, not just pro-social outcomes, healthy eating, exercise, but also the behaviour we want to see in the workplaces.
And this is where I worry sometimes, and I've seen this in my own students. I realise I equip students with tools. They are equipping me with tools all the time, and it is up to you how you wield that tool. And we know that the sort of things we've talked about here, even though I bring a pro-social lens to the things I do, can absolutely be used to do the complete opposite. Can be used to harm, to profit, to do whatever. And finding that level of ethicality, that introspection to say, well, what are my values? What is right? What is wrong? Why am I doing this? Learning stuff is a tiny, tiny part of your education. Learning about yourself is surely the ultimate goal, and hopefully we do both of those things as part of it. If you come away with effectively a stack of PowerPoint slides in that you can read over and learn, we've not done our job.
Well, we say in our critical thinking teaching, which is very similar, this stuff takes a day to learn, and it takes a lifetime to master.